We're going to move in though into the official program now, which is about sustainable responses for post-COVID-19 economic recovery. And we do have a wonderful panel for you today. And I really have no official role other than to pass us now to our very capable moderator for this session. We have President Alicia Williams-Grant from Antigua and Barbuda, who has agreed to chair this meeting for us. It was actually President Williams-Grant in our previous meeting. We did a meeting about holding virtual sessions, and she said the next meeting has to be about economic recovery. It's so critical for the Caribbean region, and therefore, you know, us at ParlAmericas, we listen to our feedback. Also, Speaker Simmons also echoed that request, I do have to say. And so we like to respond to feedback, and so we are delighted to bring you this meeting. So President Williams-Grant, I would like to pass the chairmanship to you. Chairpersonship.
Good morning, everybody, colleagues. It is always a pleasure to be in your presence, even though it's virtually. And I am again humbled to be offered the opportunity to share in this exercise through ParlAmericas, a very important partner in our work here in Antigua and Barbuda, and I'm sure for your parliaments as well throughout the region. And I am again very humbled to be given the opportunity. As Alicia indicated, a few weeks ago, we had a meeting of the presiding officers, which was very, very helpful, at least for me, and I'm sure our colleagues would agree with that position. And so we're very glad that we have the opportunity now to extend the discussion to our other parliamentary colleagues, not just the presiding officers. So let me say good morning to everyone, especially our honored guests and dignitaries. It is again my privilege to welcome you to this ParlAmericas online meeting for parliamentarians of the Americas and the Caribbean, titled Sustainable Responses for Post-COVID-19 Economic Recovery. I want to take a moment to thank our valued partners, again, of course, CARICOM, the Inter-American Development Bank, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC. And I also want to single out and acknowledge the members of the Board of SeaWorld who will be a part of this process this morning. We are very grateful for their participation in the panel session. I want to say to our esteemed guest, thank you very much for your presence in this meeting. And we look forward to the interaction that will follow. A little later, I will discuss the little ground rules that we will have. And of course, we are time sensitive today. Many of us have very busy schedules, and we expect that our absolute cutoff would be at 12:30. That didn't manifest on our last occasion. You know, parliamentarians, we like to talk, but we will try our best today to observe the rules that are in play, particularly because we are living in kind of challenging times with the COVID, and being in this environment for too long is not best. I should say as well that I noticed Senator President Humphreys had indicated and did a roll call for his members. We do have present here in the chamber. I'm actually in the chamber at Parliament here in Antigua, and I have 4 of my other colleagues. One came and left because there were too many persons and she didn't bring her laptop. And so she was cognizant of the environment in which we're operating. So she will join us later. But we do have all of our members present. Well, not all of our members, some of our members present and participating in this. I also want to, at this time, recognize the contribution of the Government of Canada to ParlAmericas, which makes it possible to continue convening of virtual meetings of parliamentarians of the Americas and the Caribbean during the COVID-19 pandemic. And this has given us an opportunity to exchange good practices across the hemisphere. To open this meeting now, I would like to present the welcoming remarks of member of the National Assembly of Ecuador and President of ParlAmericas, Elizabeth Cabezas, in a video she has prepared for us. And this will ask the ParlAmericas team to assist us in presenting.
Reciban un cordial saludo, señores parlamentarios, sobre todo para aquellos de habla inglesa, con quienes hoy tendremos justamente esta reunión sobre las repercusiones económicas y las perspectivas de género tras la pandemia del COVID-19. Definitivamente esta crisis sanitaria que nos ha abordado a todos los países del mundo sin excepción ha dejado importantes evidencias, sobre todo de las falencias estructurales que los países de la región mantienen. De hecho, las cifras de la CEPAL dan cuenta de que los impactos económicos de esta pandemia repercutirán en un decrecimiento de un 5.3% del Producto Interno Bruto en todos estos países y arrojarán al desempleo a cerca de 12 millones de ciudadanos. Estas, que son cifras preocupantes, tienen que ser justamente las que nos permitan visualizar y analizar la importancia de una legislación adecuada mirando hacia el futuro, para preservar los empleos, incentivar la producción, pero sobre todo buscar nuevos mecanismos de producción que sean amigables con el medio ambiente y que obliguen a los ciudadanos a tener mejores conductas, inclusive desde el consumo. La pandemia además ha generado una crisis social, no solamente por los desempleos, sino por las relaciones de inequidad que han sido más evidentes ahora más que nunca. Y de hecho, las personas con mayor vulnerabilidad dentro de estos grupos sociales somos y son las mujeres, quienes no solamente tienen que atender sus actividades cotidianas, sino que se han visto inmersas en las agresiones familiares de su entorno, lo cual tiene repercusiones psicológicas en el mediano y en el largo plazo. Si bien esta pandemia se constituye en una tragedia, podemos recordarla así o hacer de esta una gran oportunidad para poder pensar en el futuro y legislar, sobre todo pensando en mejorar estas estructuras que ahora nos hacen tan vulnerables y sobre todo pensar en el futuro de un país con mejores bases, con mejor sociedad, porque el mundo no será el mismo después de esta pandemia del COVID-19. Bienvenidos a esta reunión y estoy seguro que sus aportes e intercambio de ideas y de criterios alimentarán las decisiones y sobre todo las visiones que desde ParlAmericas necesitamos mantener para colaborar y vernos siempre integrados en el mundo. Bienvenidos y un gusto saludarles.
We wish to thank President Cabezas for very welcoming remarks, and you would have noted that a number of the issues she highlighted in her presentation we expect to be a part of our discussions this morning. The economic impact for our small developing states as members of the ParlAmericas community is very, very critical, and particularly as it relates to the social crises that might be facing us, and domestic violence and a number of other issues we expect to be covering today in our discussion. So very timely and welcoming remarks. Of course, in this time of profound disruption due to the pandemic, the present health crisis where economies in the region have been notoriously hard hit, the purpose of this meeting is to convene around a question that must be at the center of our legislative agenda. How can we, governments in the hemisphere, respond to the crisis with effective economic recovery measures that are gender sensitive and sustainable, while fostering inclusivity and climate change resilience? Two objectives that are crucial for our countries. To assist us navigate through the discussion today, the expert panelists that we have will address that question from multiple angles and the areas of expertise, offering practical measures that parliaments can take to address the crisis. The renowned panel includes Ambassador Irvin Larocque, the Secretary General of the CARICOM community, CARICOM, Monica Kaiser, Head of Social Policy Division of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, Therese Turner-Jones, General Manager of the Country Development Caribbean Group of the Inter-American Development Bank, and Diana Carles, Chief of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLAC, the sub-regional headquarters for the Caribbean, my apologies. After the panel discussions, we will have the open floor for interventions where you participants, my colleagues, will be able to discuss your strategies and concerns. And for that portion of the meeting, we're going to invite you to please submit the questions via the chat program, the chat option that we have on Zoom, for those of you who are familiar, or you can raise your hand. And the team the ParlAmericas team will assist me in identifying who will go next. Again, I remind you that we're constrained for time. I know we have a lot to discuss, but we're hopeful that we can conclude this by the 12:30 timeline. Before I begin again, I invite the presenters, I wish to highlight the latest ParlAmericas resource, Compendium of Legislative and Executive Actions, co-created with the National Assembly of Ecuador. And this will be pertinent to our conversation and future action. The compendium provides a comparative analysis of measures taken by countries in our hemisphere to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, while calling attention to those incorporating climate change, gender equality, and openness, which are the three pillars that guide ParlAmericas' work. So you've had enough of me, I've said enough, and I'm sure you're anxious to hear what the panelists have to say. So I will now invite our first speaker, Ambassador Erwin Larocque from the CARICOM, to begin his intervention. And so Ambassador, welcome, good morning, and the floor is all yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. And let me express my appreciation for being invited to be part of this discussion today, which I think is extremely timely. I do apologize for my scrubby look. This is the COVID look. I haven't been to a barber now for quite a bit, but here I am. If my picture offends you, I will turn off the camera. Madam Chair, the topic on the economic impact, as I said, is extremely timely. Just by way of recapping, we know what has happened in our region. Our region reacted rather swiftly to address the onslaught of the COVID. I can tell you, we began monitoring the COVID as early as January, being aware that once it left China and it went into Europe, it was only a matter of time before it went across the United States and on to the Caribbean. And we convened a series of consultations among our regional institutions, the critical ones, which have been instrumental in helping to advise and lead the reaction, as well as at the heads of government level and various ministers, trade ministers, for instance, obviously health ministers. So a number of coordinating activities has taken place. By and large, the health experts indicate that we have been fairly successful in mitigating the onslaught of the pandemic. The numbers prove it, and the University of West Indies has been doing some modeling, indicating where we are on this famous bell curve that you would have seen on our TV screens, those of us who were glued to them in the early part of the pandemic. Most of our member states were literally at the bottom part of the curve, not approaching the peak. And the numbers have borne this out. Only recently, with the exception of Haiti, and more recently, as I heard from the Member of Parliament from Suriname, in the case of Suriname, it is fair to say that prior to election, Suriname had only 10 cases. And now their numbers have gone up, I believe, to 140-something, 144 cases. And have had to go and take the measures that were required to address it. Our member states obviously reacted proportionate to and commensurate with the risk that was assessed, and entered into various modes of lockdown in phases. And that has had a very serious impact on the economies of all our member states. As a matter of fact, the projections are that our region, our member states, will experience negative growth for this year, with the exception of Guyana. And the Guyana case is exceptional in the sense that of the great oil find. But even then, the Guyana projection, growth projection, was decreased from, I believe, 80+% to somewhere about 56%. The member states at the same time have had to expend quite a bit of resources to get ready before the arrival of COVID to deal with the issue. At a time when, by virtue of having to close the borders, having to close the ports, having to close to some extent the internal economy, revenue was declining, and you had a situation of expenditure increasing. For April, I can just use 1 or 2 member states just to give an example. For April, I was checking around to see what was the revenue intake, how was it working out for small member states. Revenue in April declined for quite a few of them in the range of 50% of revenue, and expenditure went up. In May, I'm hearing figures of 70% decline in revenue. That is very, very significant at a time when you have to put in place quarantine measures, you're seeking to procure the necessary COVID, the PPEs, the test kits, and the like, and even in many instances, ventilators had to be imported at a time when the prices were skyrocketing, and our region was faced with literally in 1 or 2 instances on the day of delivery that the price would dramatically increase, and you're told take it or leave it because I have a bigger order to come for you. The point being that as a region collectively in CARICOM, our demand for some of those, some of the equipment, some of the medications, the test kits, was very minuscule in comparison to the national demand. So you had these different issues dealing with in trying to address what you're doing. The economic impact has been most severe in the tourism-dependent economies. The Caribbean region has been said to be the most tourism-dependent region in the world. And it's borne out by some of the figures. I'm sure my colleagues, Diane and others will give us some of these detailed figures. But you see that tourism can contribute as much as 50 to 60% of GDP. And if you, by extension, when you look at the job impact on our member states, the job impact of tourism in our member states can be as high as that as well, 60 to 70%, not in the direct tourism sector, but it's the knock-on effect of the tourism sector. And the small businesses have been affected. The services sector, the small services sector, as we know, have been adversely affected. And many of these small services sector are led by women. It has had a knock-on effect on the agriculture sector. We saw some disparities in the agriculture market, where production, in some countries, you had production and distribution of food declining slightly, and then in others, you had situations where you had oversupply of certain products. Those countries where you had a greater integration of tourism into agriculture experienced that with farmers and other private sector food processors having to destroy actually some of the food supplies. And all of these things have had a very significant impact on the economy. Member states have tried their best to put in social safety nets, I beg your pardon, to ensure that the persons can continue to survive, basically to survive. Where we are right now, we have put in place a regional agriculture food security plan. Member states are seeking to match demand with supply, and at the national level, put in measures to support the agriculture sector, the food supply sector. We have also looked at issues of procuring regionally, procuring together the much needed supplies, the medical supplies. PAHO, the Pan American Health Organization, has been very helpful to us. I want to single them out, as well as CARFA, CDEMA, and forgive me, I'm using terms that you may not be familiar with, but the Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency, the Caribbean Public Health Agency, and others have been extremely helpful in coordinating the response in our member states. The Pan American Health Organization was able to provide assistance by virtue of ramping up capacity in some member states for testing. And for those countries that did not have immediate testing, CARFA, the Caribbean Public Health Agency, providing testing facilities. And you have to imagine that tests being done in some member states have to be flown down to Trinidad and Tobago, which is where CARFA is headquartered, and then return, the results return. And that is something that's going up and down and is being done by one of our regional organizations, the Regional Security System. The plane literally is offering a courier service to the member states to bring those tests down as member states continue to rely on CARFA for the testing facilities. We continue to experience difficulties in obtaining supplies, the reagents and the test kits. But it's not as bad as it was before, but it continues to be a problem. Again, I want to single out PAHO, because this being you're called ParlAmericans, and I noticed that membership is from across the Americas. PAHO is in dire straits at the moment in terms of its financial situation, with the largest contributor deciding not to contribute. And forgive me if I'm being impolitic, but I am going to speak it as I see it, because PAHO has been such a very good friend to the Caribbean in terms of COVID. We could see that the resources would result in probably a decline in the kind of assistance that PAHO could give to us. And that is very, very significant at a time when our member states are in fact considering, how do you reopen? How do you restart the economy? For us, for many of our member states, it's a matter of almost having no choice. How long can you sustain an economy, very, very open economy, from allowing the importation, allowing services to come in, from allowing tourists to come in, and to allow the resuscitation of the economy. And from a regional perspective, again, we started consultations on that, I believe, as early as May. I believe Senator Humphrey might have been part of that first consultation, the Caribbean Congress of Labor, in its capacity of the Caribbean Congress of Labor, and others who were on, and the private sector. And protocols were developed, being very mindful that you need to open, but you need to take care of the health of our population. Where we are right now, since May, member states have different levels of reopening. The first phase is always to reopen your internal economy, to get the internal jobs moving again, and we're seeing what's happening at the national level. And now there's discussion on opening regionally. Each member state will assess, based on the protocols that have been developed, their particular. My apologies. Yeah, I'm sorry, the phone went off. My deepest apologies. I'm doing quite a bit of multitasking here in Guyana. Yeah, so member states have had to balance between opening the economies, putting in the requisite protocols at the national level to continue to ensure the safety of the citizenry at a time when we still have a difficulty in accessing all of the necessary testing material that we need. But as one prime minister said, you have to balance between what will be the long-term effect of how do you live with COVID, because it's not going to go away anytime soon. The vaccines, we are told, will not be available until sometime early in the year, and we know what's going on with the test kits, the ability to access it at affordable prices, and I can only imagine what could happen with the situation with vaccines coming down the road. So, Madam Chair, I know my time is up. I could have spoken for much, much longer on this because there's so much going on. But that is where we are. It's a very, very difficult situation of balancing between opening up, putting persons back to work, reviving the economy, especially those who are most marginalized in terms of the general economic activity. And I just want to mention all of this is taking place within the context of the start of the hurricane season. Within the start of the hurricane season. June 1 marked the start of our hurricane season. Climate change has not gone away because of COVID. It's still there. And already we've seen 3 named storms. And one of the issues that every time I mention climate change, and it has come up again in the context of COVID, it just baffles me. Why is it that it is not understood that the small vulnerable economies of CARICOM, and I'm going to speak on behalf of my partners, my colleagues in the Pacific, and also those in the Indian Ocean, the small island states. Why is it that we're still judged on per capita income to get the much needed resources to address climate change in the big picture? And I've been speaking about this like a broken record now from the start of my term, which is going back too many years to recount. And now again with COVID, we are being assessed on the ability to access concessionary financing on per capita GDP that measured last year. And as Prime Minister Motley has so eloquently said, It is like taking your blood pressure in December of last year and applying the medication today, because it doesn't make sense. We've experienced in the past 2 months, 3 months, 70% decline in economic activity in many of our countries. I'm using the higher figure. But yet we're being assessed as if the economy was trucking along as it were at the end of December 2020. And as parliamentarians, to the extent that you have outreach to other parliamentarians in your organization, to the extent that you have outreach to others as well, particularly in the developed countries, and I have taken careful note that we have a colleague from the OECD. I think the OECD can take leadership on this. I know the OECD began looking at the per capita income issue post-disaster, and I regret to say that's not sufficient, because we know the hurricane season comes every year. We know the pandemics come ever so often. You need to have to take into account the fragility of our economies, the fragility of our environment, and allow for us to be able to access concessionary financing to allow us to address. My apologies for going so long, Madam Chairperson, but here it is. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador, and I think we're all encouraged by your presentation, because you've touched on quite a bit of hot button issues, but the last one more so than any for us in this region. And I suspect that will form a part of the discussions. I don't want to start talking now to break the momentum, but we're very grateful for your presentation and the steps taken as a regional grouping, CARICOM, to mitigate or deal with the steps of the pandemic, and identifying the phases of recovery that the member states have been embarking on. At this time, I will go straight to our next panelist, Ms. Diane Callas, who's the chief of ECLAC, the sub-regional headquarters for the Caribbean. Here, Ms. Callas, we'll invite you to make your presentation.
Very good. Good morning, everyone, Excellencies. Such a pleasure to be with you this morning, and so very pleased to speak after my esteemed Secretary General, who has made such a powerful presentation to start the discussion this morning. I can only say ditto, ditto, ditto. The points that he has made are sort of echoed in my files and in my slides, and I'm very much aware of the time. So forgive me for going a little bit fast. The PowerPoint presentation will be shared with you. It is important, I think, to set the stage and to give a little bit more data based on the information that Secretary General LaRocque presented. The issue of debt, and I have shown you here the trajectory of debt and the inverse relationship to growth in the history of the Caribbean over the last 20 years. And as you will see,
Ms. Callas, we're having a little issue here with your you're freezing up quite a bit, so I'm not sure how many persons would have heard what you just said.
Oh,
or is it just us?
Was it a temporary thing?
It's temporary, yes. Freezes and goes.
She didn't freeze for me, so I think she's fine for most people.
Okay.
Okay.
So
all right. You could proceed. Yes, sorry.
Yes.
It was clear here.
I'm speaking about the contextualizing the challenge that we currently face with COVID by reiterating the points made by Secretary General LaRocque in respect of the debt situation in the region, because the debt and the extent of public debt, and if you will see on the graph to the right, the orange is the amount of domestic debt. So we have both domestic and external debt, and more than 11 of our countries have a debt to GDP ratio that is in excess of 60%, or at least 60%, which is the percentage decreed unsustainable by the fund, by the IMF. And if you look at our growth trajectory, which is the orange line in the left graph, you will see that we're heading somewhere down to an average of about 5 or 6% negative growth this year anticipated because of COVID. We are dramatically impacted by exogenous factors. The last dip that you see there was about 10 years ago during the global financial crisis. The pandemic has the same essential impact on the countries of our region. So we need to think about that debt. The debt service is even more relevant to our parliamentarians because that speaks to the capacity, the fiscal space that governments and parliaments have to make interventions at home. An average of 30% over the last 10, 15 years. In some cases, debt service went as high as 102%. That's your entire GDP. 74%. Even in 2018, there was one country with I think it was St. Lucia, with a debt service of 74.9%. You see on the right-hand side the total amount of debt service paid by governments in the last 19 years. Going very quickly, average growth, as I have indicated, the impact of COVID on growth is expected to be quite phenomenal. You put that within the context of continuing declining overseas development assistance. As SG LaRocca said, we are middle-income countries, middle to high-income countries, and therefore undeserving of concessional support as far as the international community is concerned, notwithstanding the vulnerabilities that the countries face. You look at the ODA for low-income countries and heavily indebted countries. The Caribbean is the blue line, almost flatlining at zero. That is the level of development assistance that the Caribbean has continued to have over the past 40, 50 years. Not much better in foreign direct investment, a decline, constant decline. We went from 9% GDP to 3% GDP in FDI over the last 10 years. We had a slight uptick after the big storms, Irma and Maria, after 2017. But generally, foreign direct investment, very, very low in the region. Again, because of economies of scale, because investors really are only concerned about the bottom line. Here we speak to the issue of tourism, which is, with the exception of perhaps now Guyana, Trinidad and Tobago and Suriname, tourism is the lifeblood of the countries of the region. And visitor arrival, because of COVID, we have modeled in ECLAC recently 3 scenarios: a base scenario, a pessimistic scenario, and an optimistic scenario. At the optimistic level, we will have a fall of 57% in tourism in the region. Pessimistically, 75% loss of tourism in the region in 2020. The optimistic scenario gives us a $22 billion loss in tourism in 2020. And the pessimistic will go as far as $28 billion in loss for the Caribbean because of the necessity of the lockdown that we have had. Specifically, with respect to transportation, 74% of revenue in cruise lines and cruise income to the region in 6 months of this year. 74% of those revenues, that's a 0.6 billion, 0.6 billion will be lost. And as in respect of or even regional travel, air travel, 94% for disruption and loss in our regional airline income as a result of COVID. And we're estimating for only an 8-month period. So we're talking about countries that are already heavily indebted, with very narrow fiscal space, facing almost complete annihilation of income for the year. That's where we're starting. Now we look at the response, the necessary response to COVID in the region. And with the exception of Barbados, you will see that we're averaging about 4% of GDP invested in various fiscal packages through social security programs, liquidity support, fiscal support, the investment in the health infrastructure that we have of necessity had to put in place, much of what SG has spoken to. Barbados, of course, as you see, is quite an outlier, investing almost 20% of its current GDP in these fiscal packages and in response to COVID. Now we're speaking of, again, as reflected by the SG, that we're a couple of weeks away from actually the hurricane season has actually begun. It's an early season. Already three invested. Three hurricanes, or no, named storms, and we are all highly vulnerable to the impact of these. Provided for you here, I won't go into detail, a link between the level of indebtedness and vulnerability, and you will see that, and this is a comparison with other Commonwealth small states, and all of the top 8 of those, most highly indebted and most vulnerable, they're all Caribbean. So we're speaking about, and the circumstances for that vulnerability that we also need to take into consideration. The fact that 70% of our populations live on the coast, and that the majority of the orange line are the people, the blue, the infrastructure. That's the percentage of population and infrastructure that live on the coast under 15 feet above sea level. And when the storm surges come, they're averaging 30 feet above sea level. So you're talking about the majority of our infrastructure and our population exposed to storms when they come into the region. Factors in fact impacting poverty and inequality. These are the fundamental social challenges that our countries face, and these are the cracks in our social infrastructure that have now become fissures as a result of COVID. The COVID has dramatically exacerbated issues of employment and informality, and the risk of our women in particular, who represent 2/3 of our informal sector. All of these issues are impacted by the economic stress that has been presented by COVID. Here I have the populations under the poverty line. The green line is the population under the poverty line. The blue is youth unemployment, as you can see, over 40% in some cases, and at least 10% unemployment across the board in the Caribbean. Here are some of the issues or remedial investment that has been invested by our region. Payroll support of 343 million, grants to businesses 167 million, unemployment benefits, public assistance. You can review it on your own in your time. I have only 10 minutes, unfortunately. Education. Here are the issues, and education is one that has created a new look at the levels of inequality, because now that the children are at home, we're faced with the situation of, is there technological infrastructure that allows for equity in access to education? We need to look at the issues of increased incidence of family violence. The fact that many students depended on getting food at school. What does that do with them when now they're at home? The impact on nutrition. A number of issues that have been, the fissures have been exposed, have been expanded in the face of the COVID impact. I mean, I might be speaking to the converted, but I thought that it was important because of the emphasis that ECLAC has been placing on the importance of parliamentary involvement in SDG implementation. And we have been focusing on strengthening sustainable development strategies, the investment in strengthening national development infrastructure, and and the national development plans, we have been encouraging a greater level of ownership, participation, and accountability on the part of parliamentarians, because we cannot afford to have short-term focus on development in our countries. It needs to be on a long-term basis. And therefore, that ownership and participation in a national development plan that transcends the party in power and is embraced by all parliamentarians. This is important. The monitoring and assessment, because we do not have sufficient data to give meaningful assessment and to strengthen the advocacy on the part of our governments. And the whole issue of planning and legislative decision making, these are all issues that are deserving of the attention of parliamentarians. I've highlighted here critical issues that need to be taken on board, generally speaking, but as I said, have been exacerbated by COVID. The issues of women empowerment, inequality, investing in our youth, issues of unemployment and social protection. You have that information. Again, the issues that have been addressed by your countries in terms of the payroll support and unemployment benefits and moratoriums, postponement of payments, much attention given to supporting, particularly because many women are in the tourism sector, and the tourism sector has been so dramatically impacted across the board, to ensure that there is support to supplementary income to tourism workers that have been out of work for a long time. Many governments, and here we provide information on initiatives being implemented by various countries in respect of addressing the challenges that COVID has presented to education in terms of school closures, in terms of nutrition assessments, and so on. The whole question of, are we going to get to take our CXC and other exams? All of those issues have been addressed. We have captured all of that in a portal that we have established at the ECLAC website that covers all of these issues, the lockdowns and all of these sectoral things. You can go to the ECLAC website, check your country. You will find that, or any country in the region, we have captured all of this information that has been done through our research over the past 2-3 months. The way forward, we need to be talking about strengthening statistical infrastructure, data capacity, evidence-based decision-making, critical. We need to be talking about innovative access to finance, long-term, low-cost financing things, investing in social protection, expanding production schemes. The question of national development planning, as I have said, that must be a parliamentary approach. We need a social contract that involves government and others. Strengthening national institutions, strengthening health infrastructure, reorienting our risk strategy, not only to address hurricanes, but now pandemics, strengthening partnership, private sector, global partners. We need to ensure that we have the private sector on board. They are an important partner in this. Final station identification, I invite you to check the ECLAC website. We have many papers that we have done recently on COVID and its impact in the region, which would, I think, inform and enrich your deliberations in parliaments. And thank you for your time.
Well, thank you, Ms. Carlos, for your very comprehensive presentation on the economic and social challenges that we face in the region and which the pandemic has exacerbated. Particularly, we should take note as parliamentarians of the role that we play in this exercise. And I know we all look forward to going through your presentation in further detail. Thank you very much again. I wish now to invite Ms. Kaiser, to the head of the social division of OECD, to make her presentation.
Thank you so much to ParlAmericas for inviting the OECD to this event. It's a very interesting meeting. Most of the countries in your region obviously are not OECD countries, but that is why it's so incredibly interesting for me to listen to your experiences. And I found that so much of what I've heard in the last two presentations is so mirrors what is going on in other OECD countries, that I believe that this will still be interesting for you, even though it is a group of countries which you're not directly working with or working in. Now, I was asked by the ParlAmericas organization to also focus a little bit on the general economic outlook. We had just presented yesterday the new projections of the OECD in our economic outlook. And for those of you who are interested, there's a lot, you will find a lot of detail on our website and the newest numbers, which are very, very dire indeed. So what I would like to do in my presentation is first show you a few of the results that were released yesterday, so hot off the press, and then move to the question of how what gender impacts we are seeing in OECD countries and beyond as a result of this crisis. So the OECD's outlook for the world economy. What we're seeing, as you have said before, is an unprecedented collapse in output through the first half of 2020. The numbers from our economic outlook estimate that world GDP in the second quarter of 2020 will be about 12.5% lower than in the fourth quarter, so the end of 2019. In the OECD area alone, it will be down by about 15%. And in the Euro area, it will be down by over 18%. So the Euro area is the most touched, then the OECD, and then the global outlook, 12.5%. So here are some of the numbers that you can see for those members here. Canada is right here. You can see Canada right here. You can see the hardest hit countries. No surprise, that is something that you've heard, of course, all in the media. Spain, France, and Italy, which had very severe lockdowns, much more severe than most other countries in Europe, and that, of course, is a sign here that you can see directly translating into strong losses of GDP. Now, this time, something new happened in the OECD projections. This is something that we've never done before, because there is so much uncertainty as to how the situation will evolve in the future. We actually have two different scenarios. We have one scenario, which you can see here in red, is the single hit scenario. And then in green, you can see the double hit scenario. And the double hit scenario, as you can all imagine, is there's a lot of talk of a possible second wave of the virus, which could start again in the fall. So people have said that we also need to take into account that a second hit could come, and that is the green curve you see here. So you have on the left-hand panel, you have world GDP, and here you have OECD GDP. The blue line are the projections that we produced and presented in November 2019. So you could see we were here really on a nice upward trajectory. The single hit scenario, this is what we're observing until now here. So this is the massive decline, which corresponds to what we just saw also on Diane's slides. And here we have the double hit scenario, which is the green or the red, where it's slowly going back up again. And this will not be a short and sharp recovery, because one of the reasons is that these lockdown measures are being gradually lifted, and many of the service sector companies, and you were just talking about tourism, for example, they have to operate well below full capacity for a long time. So you can see hotels opening around the world, restaurants opening, but take Paris, where we are based here, for example, restaurants can only operate outside, not inside. So as soon as there's a rain shower, then they already have to stop, and they can only serve far fewer clients than they usually can. And it's also difficult for these restaurants, for example, or other service sectors to recover, because just because you can go to the restaurant again doesn't mean you're going to go every night to make up for the time that you weren't going during the lockdown. And then some of the companies are, of course, going to be insolvent. Some of them are now already insolvent, but for them to operate at below full capacity for a long time is going to be very difficult. And so we're for the double hit scenario, we're also saying that if this should happen, another second wave, this is based on a less severe lockdown. So there would be lockdown again, but it would not be done in the very severe ways that the first lockdown was done. So you can see that either way, the situation is very, very dramatic, particularly if you compare it to the trajectory we were on still in November 2019. Now that was just for the short overlook. There's lots more information on this. Unemployment figures obviously are also very, very uncertain. What the situation we have in many European countries is that we have a lot of people countries using so-called short-time work schemes, where the government pays part of the payroll, and the workers are kept in employment by the company, but they're working much reduced hours, and the government is helping companies shoulder the cost of this. The advantage of this is, of course, that when recovery comes, the people are still there, the workers are still there, and companies do not have to go and rehire and don't lose these people, but can quickly remobilize their workforce when the situation becomes better. But what it also means, of course, is that not all of the workers that are in these short-time work schemes at the moment will actually find re-employment immediately again. And so there is some likely future unemployment that we'll have to deal with even in those countries that are using the short-term work schemes. Now with that, let me move to the actual topic of this meeting, women and the COVID-19 crisis. What I've brought for you here, and this was already also mentioned by the previous speakers, women are very often overrepresented among essential service workers. And here, for example, you can see that in OECD countries, the distribution of the long-term workforce, long-term care workforce, long-term care homes were very, very hard hit in the COVID crisis here in Europe, for example, and in other OECD countries. And that means, of course, that the workers in long-term care were very much affected by exposure to the virus. And you can see here that the overwhelming majority of long-term care workers in all countries, the OECD average is around 90% are women. So I don't think you have to say anything further to that, what that means for women. And not only are they women, but they're often also in very precarious work, because not all of the jobs in this, or the majority of jobs in long-term care, are actually not very well paid. They're often not full-time employment. They're often, people have to go around to different homes and places to take care of their clients. And it's often very difficult work conditions for bad pay and low job security. And it shows you that women are carrying this burden in a large majority. If you take the health workforce more broadly, then you can say that in OECD countries, women make about half of all doctors. So there we have a more or less gender equal situation. But if we look at the nurses, and then globally, and I'm sure you all in your countries can confirm this, about 2/3 of the health workforce are women. And that's a large majority of nurses and midwives are women. So again, these are the people who are on the forefront of the fight against COVID. And of course, they've been working round the clock and have been exposed to the virus and performing their work under very difficult conditions. And I think we really have to think also how coming out of this crisis, how we're going to treat that part of the workforce. That is a very, very important point, because as our populations are aging, we're going to need more, not less, not fewer long-term care workers. And if we want to attract good workforce, we need good work conditions, good pay. And it's not enough, we're saying here, as happened in many European countries, at 8 o'clock at night, people stood up by their windows and on the balconies to applaud the incredible contributions of the long-term care and health workers. But we really have to pass to policy action. And this is also where I think parliamentarians, along with trade unions and the social partners, have a very, very important role to play to make sure that these jobs in the social services are not dead-end jobs, but actually attractive, and that they're jobs. These are people who take care of those who we value and cherish the most, our children and our elderly, and we have to make sure that they can perform these jobs under good conditions. Moving to the next slide. Oops, sorry. Here we have the unpaid work. This was also already raised by Diane. The unpaid work, meaning cooking, caring, cleaning at home, is overwhelmingly performed by women in all countries around the world. And you can see, if you look at the 3 countries on the left side here, you'll see the famous Scandinavian countries, which always excel in gender equality. And I'm happy to report that Canada is right next to them. So Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Canada, these are the countries that are the most gender equal. And you can still see that it is almost an hour or more. In Canada, it's more than an hour. The Scandinavian countries are just around 50 minutes, where that women are doing more per day in terms of unpaid work than men. And if you go to countries on the right-hand side, like Mexico, Portugal, Turkey, you can see, of course, that there is a huge difference. And again, now that people were in lockdown, women have been doing all of this cooking, caring, and cleaning work, but they've also been taking care overwhelmingly of homeschooling, which was much less the fathers. And if there's anything we should learn is that there were some fathers in this lockdown period who did take care of their children, and we have to make sure that those gains are preserved and that we don't go back to the normal situation. So when the family is in lockdown, there is really no reason why the women should be doing all the work when the father is locked up with the family. And I think also there we have a huge challenge, because it's not only for parliamentarians to change the situation, but we need to change social norms and make sure that this happens at home. And that is not so easy to change, which I'm sure you will all confirm that that is one of the biggest challenges, and one that for which we don't have enough tools, really. Here we've also looked at employment. Unlike past crises, women may be more at risk in the pandemic. This is something where in the past crisis in 2008, the great financial crisis, we saw that actually women's employment increased in many cases to make up for lost jobs of men that men lost in manufacturing and construction and so on. Here now we're seeing that women's jobs are being very hard hit. And if you look at the left-hand panel, you can see that for men and women, there was, of course, with the onset of the crisis and the lockdowns, there was a massive decline. But we're seeing early numbers out of Canada also now that are showing that men's jobs are recovering more quickly than those for women. So this may be a situation where we see more jobs disappearing, and on the right-hand side, you can see the month-on-month change in employment by sex since last summer. And here you can see that in the beginning in March, women's jobs were more lost than men's jobs. Then men's jobs slightly more in April, but in May there was some recovery, but recovery was more important for the men than for the women. So this is of course also very early, and with the caveat of what I said before on the short-time work schemes, we of course don't know how this is going to evolve in the broader in the further future. So at the moment we're not really quite in a situation to say exactly how the rebound will be. One thing that could act in the favor of women is that women are more often employed in public sector jobs, and these initially were less hit than the private sector. However, if you look at all the debt numbers that Diane just showed and Erwin talked about as well, then of course you can expect that public sector retrenchment is also down the road at some point in the future, at which point those jobs will be hit as well. Here, and again, this was also mentioned before already, what we've seen is that domestic violence has increased dramatically during the pandemic. We at the OECD have been working on domestic violence for a while now, and I had a big conference just before lockdown started. And then we were shocked ourselves to see to what extent this has been a problem, and people were quite helpless to how to help women. There were some some countries that tried interesting things, like, for example, having code words for women who were suffering from abuse at pharmacies, having some in the shopping centers and so on, where women were allowed to go alone, to have some help spaces. But of course, it was a very difficult time also for the shelters, which were also affected by lockdown, social distancing, and so on. And this is something we really, I think, if there's one advantage as far as this issue is concerned, is now that it's in everybody's conscience. And here is something where I think parliamentarians have a hugely important role to play, because access to justice is something where many countries are lagging behind for victims of domestic violence, and there the situation can be greatly improved. And just want to say that the OECD is working on this topic, and we would of course be very happy to work together with all of you as well. Now, what are the policies that can be done? Again, Diane had these up on her slides also. These are all things that need to be done anyway, and we would have to do these, COVID crisis or not crisis. And we've been advocating these for a long time. Family care needs, we need better childcare, better elderly care, we need special leave for people that some countries have this for the workers who are affected by school or childcare closures, but we also need more parental leave in general, and leave that goes to fathers, because that is something, one of the few areas that we've identified where we can actually start changing social norms. If there's parental leave that is exclusively reserved for fathers. Then I've talked already about the short-time work schemes and the out-of-work benefits. Again, Diane mentioned these already. The help for small business owners, and this is of course something we saw in your region has been happening, financial facilities for small businesses, but then access to financial measures for them themselves if they do not qualify for out-of-work benefits. We also have some work done on this emergency help, what happens to people, and what have countries been doing to help persons that are not included in the formal social protection systems because they're self-employed, because they're temporary or precarious workers. So I would encourage you to visit the hub of the OECD on the coronavirus, where you find more information on that. And then I've already mentioned the victims and survivors of domestic violence. Shelters are very important, engaging with women and children at risk very proactively, and find new innovative ways to engage also in justice, and use remote hearings to ensure that the lockdowns, and if we have new ones again, do not obstruct women's access to justice. So I think there's a tall agenda for all of you that can be used. Something that we've also been recommending is to use gender impact assessments and tools, even also in emergency management, because sometimes people think that that's only something for good times when you have time to reflect, but gender impact assessments should be part and parcel of every legislative measure. Gender budgeting is something that it goes along those same lines, and is something that more and more OECD countries are introducing in a systematic way. And finally, let me point out the last point. Ensure that women's voices are well heard in the decision-making process. Far too many commissions, bodies, authorities that were instituted to deal with crisis management had very few women on it, and we're very worried and concerned that women's concerns are not heard enough if women are not properly represented on all of those decision-making bodies and advisory bodies as well. With that, I've come to the end. Here is the information for our gender website, but also you could go to the OECD General website, where you immediately are going to find all of this information on the economic outlook, but on many other topics related to COVID-19. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you kindly, Monica. That was very interesting, and we are all partners in this fight. So even though we may not be part of your organization, we appreciate the effort and your interventions at this time, particularly noting the importance of taking women into account at all levels in the discussion. Thank you again. I wish to now invite our final panelist for the morning, Ms. Therese Turner-Jones, General Manager of the Country Department, Caribbean Group of Inter-American Development Bank, to make her presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. First of all, I want to thank all of you for organizing this really important session at this particular time. Very distinguished and excellent presentation so far, and just want to say that in my presentation, I'm going to concentrate on some Caribbean data, which I think will give more texture to what Monica just described. Obviously, women are being impacted more severely than men in this crisis, and just because of all the reasons you just described, the so-called care sectors, and so the burden falling on them has been quite severe. I want to also emphasize the importance of parliamentarians absorbing this information, because I think often for those of us who are working in trying to influence policy in the Caribbean, we don't have allies, sufficient allies in Parliament on some of these issues. So I want to say this is a really progressive move that you've taken today to be discussing these issues in this depth and with some of the best advice that you could get anywhere. So first of all, a few months ago, I published a blog about a fictional Jamaican woman who has graduated from UWI with a science degree, and she's trying to look for a job. Now, what is interesting is that UWI says that 65% of all the graduates, and this is in the last 3 years, so it's an average. Although now, if you go to a University of the West Indies graduation ceremony, almost 90% of all of the graduates are female. So, you know, given that women are coming out with tertiary level institution degrees and are qualified, they apply for jobs, they may get a job, but obviously life is pretty complicated. First of all, despite the fact that women are matriculating much faster than men, we still find in the Caribbean that, you know, women are making 60 to 70 cents on every dollar that a man makes. The World Bank study on women, business, and law, 2020 report, showed scores for our region between 7 and 75 out of 100 on pay equity and opportunities for women in the corporate world. Guyana is the only country with a score of 100. And if you look at Guyana's history, it's no surprise that they would have a score of 100 because they've had a long history of political change towards more equity and social inclusion. So that's interesting. You know, if this woman wanted to, if she had children, what would her opportunities look like? Would she have paid maternity leave? This is a really big issue in the region, because paid maternity leave, sorry, because whether we like it or not, there's still very few countries in the region that offer full paid maternity leave. Besides, parental leave and even paternity leave is something that's not recognized in the region, and we have a lot of room here to increase fathers' participation in child rearing. So the longest maternity leave benefit in the Caribbean is 14 weeks, and that can be found in Trinidad and Tobago and Belize. And when we compare it with 2 OECD countries, the UK of 33 weeks and Canada of 30 weeks, we realize that we're really lacking, and we're holding women back in terms of their ability to not only look after children, but also hold on to their jobs after. And in terms of holding on to their jobs, you know, if you were to, when you go back to work, there's no guarantee that you're going to go back at the position that you were in, and you would have been severely compromised in terms of payroll intake. And so this is another complication for women. Women working in male-dominated environments. A Caribbean woman is more likely to be sexually harassed. So this is not, this is just one of those issues which we are not paying enough attention to, but according to the National Women's Health Surveys, 25% of women in Suriname, 24% of women in Jamaica have experienced sexual harassment. The highest prevalence in the region among the countries for which data is available is Jamaica. Research has shown that both domestic violence and sexual harassment are associated with high turnover and absenteeism of women, increasing firms' costs. To date, Guyana and Barbados are amongst the few Caribbean countries with specific legal protections against sexual harassment in the workplace. Belize and the Bahamas have enacted legislation against sexual harassment in general, but these are the only two. So I want to say that absent COVID, so this is the pre-COVID situation with women, but what has COVID-19 thrown up for women in the Caribbean? We did a socioeconomic online survey in April, and I want to share this data with you. We surveyed over 12,500 people in the 6 Caribbean countries in which I have responsibility, and this would be from the Bahamas all the way down to Suriname, excluding Belize and Haiti. And what we found was that while job losses have been significant overall, women have been significantly more affected than men. So about 40% of men across the 6 Caribbean countries we surveyed lost their jobs, while 47% of women did. This is really, this is statistically and economically significant and will likely exacerbate pre-existing inequalities in the labor market in terms of gender-based employment and wage gaps. So this is something we need to watch. Secondly, we also noticed that when we asked about food security and diets, only 15% of men said that they went hungry in the last week, while 22% of women said they went hungry. And in terms of how diets changed over this period, 41% of men said that they experienced some change in the healthiness of their diet, whereas 47% of women said they were eating less healthy meals. Monica just talked about gender-based violence and the fact that globally we've seen increases in gender, intimate partner violence as well as gender-based violence during the pandemic. When we asked the question, 16% of households, and we did this by income level, 16% of households who used to earn less than 1 minimum wage before the pandemic reported increased incidence of domestic violence against women. For higher level income levels, about 9% of women reported domestic violence in the household. So we know it's happening, we have the data, and it's there. The burden of domestic chores, again, we've emphasized this in the other presentations, is a significant burden on women and labor participation. During this period, 61% of households identified a woman as being primarily in charge of cleaning, while only 30% of households identified a man. And the remaining, just under 10% of households reported a balanced burden between women and men. Similarly, 57% of households identified women as being in charge of cooking for all. When it comes to children, women also disproportionately face the responsibility of changing diapers, homeschooling, and entertaining kids. So we know how COVID-19 has been affecting our families and women in particular. Now, policies moving forward. I think Monica outlined an exhaustive list, and I don't want to repeat those, but something that hasn't been said so far is that one of the issues impacting policy reform against in this area across the region has to do with political leadership. So, of course, this is exactly your purview, and I want to say that if you look at the data on women holding decision-making positions in government across the region, in the English-speaking IDB members, and those are 5 countries in the Caribbean, the percentage of women in the lower house ranges from 9%, that's in Belize, to 31% in Trinidad and Tobago, while in the upper house, the percentage varies from 21% in Belize to 44% in the Bahamas. So we have a long way to go. In Haiti, women only hold 3% of legislative seats in the lower house and no seats in the upper house. At the executive level, only Trinidad and Tobago and Barbados are headed by a woman, or have been headed by a woman, and on average, women hold only 18% ministerial positions in the English-speaking Caribbean. We have a long way to go in this. I want to say that in our response to COVID-19, we must ensure that representatives with diverse backgrounds and expertise are at the table when major decisions are being made. We know from research that when women are in leadership positions, we have different preferences, we have different perspectives than men regarding the allocation of public resources and legislative priorities. And this is why it's important that we get this right. Considering that the pandemic is disproportionately affecting women and that governments are making decisions and taking actions to address the pandemic, from the development of vaccines to social protection programs, we need women's voices to be heard and represented in the decision-making arenas. So I want to end here just to add that in the set of policies, what may be lacking there is a little more attention on issues like mental health. And in there, you know, there are lots of things that we can be doing. During this period where we've been essentially in lockdown, working from home, countries are reporting many more issues around mental health, and there are a whole bunch of things that can be done around that to provide more psychosocial support, not just to healthcare workers and gender-based violence survivors, but communities in general. And there are a whole slew of issues around how that can be done. Finally, around the prevention and response of gender-based violence, Monica mentioned many, and there are others. I think we need to also think of using technology, whether it's through social media and messaging and WhatsApp messages and so on, to reach more women and to reach more communities, not just in terms of helping women who may be suffering from violence, but also to help people understand that there are ways to report these issues and to do it in a way that protects the victims and those who are helping to reduce violence in their communities. I want to stop there. Thank you very much, and I hope that we can take this agenda forward together, and the IDP stands ready to help this region in this very difficult time. Thank you.
And thank you, Therese, for that undertaking and commitment, and we appreciate the presentation that you've made on the Caribbean perspective and the practical considerations for us as parliamentarians as we move forward. And so we have come to a very pivotal part of this morning session, discussion. But before I invite our members to participate, I want to say thank you very much to all of our expert panelists for their contributions. And we have in this called Parliamentarians from the Americas and the Caribbean with first-hand experience on the implementation of the legislative responses and oversight of government responses on the COVID pandemic. I wish to open the floor, but before I do, I just need to remind us that the team from ParlAmericas would have shared in the chat a number of resource materials that you can have access to from the presenters. And we encourage you to use them to assist in your developing a strategy to address some of the areas that we have discussed here this morning, and particularly in the execution of your duties as legislators. So you can refer to them from time to time, which we hope to will lessen not lessen, but deal with the fact that we are constrained for time. And I know that we would want persons would want to intervene and lend their contributions to the process. So at this time, I wish to invite us to make our contributions and share whatever good practices that you might have been using in your jurisdictions to assist in the dealing with the challenges that we face now. So I am waiting on the team members to tell me who is the first to have either signaled by way of hand or a note in the chat group that and then I will identify the persons. What we're going to do is have about 2 or 3 interventions, and then we will refer back to the panelists for their comments on those questions or concerns posed by the participants this morning. And to lead us off at this time, we have Senator Rosa Galvez of Canada, and she has a question for us.
Yes, thank you very much. This conversation is so important, so essential, and so critical in this time. And I'm sure that by exchanging with our fellow parliamentarians, we will come to identify the best practices. My question and reflection is directed to Mrs. Monica Quesner, because I sit in the National Finances Committee in the Senate of Canada, which is doing the oversight of all the measures, the response measures during this COVID-19 pandemic. And I'm a little bit worried about the efficiency and how do we measure the efficiency of these measures. So we all want that the injection of the funds into the economy goes to the workers, goes to the women, goes to close the gaps and to don't leave anybody behind, and to that economy remains afloat first, and that essential sectors are assisted, and later hopefully we will see some stimulus in economy. But in order for this recovery to be efficient, we have to know what to measure. So the transparency and the data collection is so important. So I know we all speak in terms of GDP, but the GDP assess only part of the things. And for example, it doesn't assess the issue with the inequalities and the gaps that we are talking about, the women and this, because GDP doesn't have sex, doesn't have, Mrs. Quesner, maybe she can elaborate and help me in the reflection on these points. Thank you.
Yes, but I think we can allow Monica to answer that question. I don't see any other person at this time.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for that question. This is a very, very important question, and you've really hit the nail on the head here, because this is a question that a lot of the countries are asking themselves at the moment. I think they've all pretty much privileged emergency response over efficiency. So that's why they've taken out basically the big arsenal to help people and just get the money out very quickly. And in many cases where they would have, if they had taken the time, they would have tried to target, for example, because all countries have measures in place to target help for through means testing, social. This is from one day to the next, people have nothing anymore in many cases, that we are going to take the risk of not being efficient, as you were saying, but just making sure we get the help to the people as quickly as we can. Now, there's some cases where we heard from some countries that in fact it wasn't that effective. For example, there's some numbers from the US that we've seen where people have applied for unemployment benefits, but they didn't get through, for example. That sometimes also the administrations were hopelessly overburdened with doing this. Sometimes they very quickly ran out of money. There's an example, for example, in Germany, where in the city of Berlin, emergency help was given to self-employed people who, of course, in many countries, including in Germany, are not in the kind of mandatory social protection system. So in order to help them, they said, okay, everybody gets a flat sum here and no questions asked. As you can imagine, there was a huge run on that fund, and very quickly it was depleted. So I think and this is really unprecedented. We've not really seen this type of massive reaction without targeting anywhere before. And it is also brought up in many countries the question of, do we need universal basic income? Should everybody have universal basic income, which is a very difficult other question. At the OECD, we're quite reserved about the answer to that, because we just believe that there's a reason why all countries are targeting measures to, in general, out of a crisis emergency context to people like, single mothers, particularly poor people, people with handicaps, people who are considered very vulnerable. But here, this was really a widespread effort to help everybody. The biggest challenge will be how to get out of this in a way that leaves nobody behind. And that also makes sure that, for example, that the short-time work schemes I talked about before really are going to those companies and workers who need it most. And I'm sure that you've heard also in the press, there were some scandals, for example, about big companies like Adidas and others who said, we're going to take advantage of the short-term work schemes and we want relief of our social security contributions and other things, where people said, wait a minute, this is not intended for companies like yours. And luckily, in a certain sense, there was also often an outcry from civil society and on social media, which were kind of sanctioning these companies which were misbehaving to take advantage of a situation that was distributing benefits which were not necessarily meant for them. The other question you asked, how can we make sure that when we address inequalities, we really reach the people that they show up in the data? That's a huge challenge. For gender, we're getting better because I think in inequality data, we see a lot of disaggregation. But of course, inequality, for example, is measured at the household level. So it's always about people living together. And it's kind of difficult to say exactly what a woman in a household is getting, because then we come to the intra-household distribution of resources also. But overall, I think we need much, much better data collections. We talked a lot about violence against women. There's basically an evidence-free zone because of the nature of the problem is such that people often do not report. And so there's really a big challenge in collecting better data. And that is something we all need to fight for. Another topic that is just very much in everybody's minds at the moment globally is race and racism. We simply do not have the tools in many cases to really be much more granular in policy, in addressing policy. But this is an even more complicated issue. For example, France, the country where I live in, refuses to collect data based on race because they're worried about discrimination precisely when they start collecting that type of data and asking people to identify as belonging to a certain race, whereas in the US it's done. So I think that's also very interesting. Additional challenge is how do we collect the data but make sure that it's used to its best purposes and not basically perverted in its use for just enforcing discrimination even more. So those are just a few short answers. Obviously, a lot more could be said, but thank you so much for that question because I think it really comes right to the point.
Thank you, Monica. We have a question from Ms. Maniva Glasgow from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And this was posed in the chat. And the question is, how can integration help the small island developing states to deal with crises? There's no blueprint for COVID-19, but we need to collaborate for effectiveness. Any member of the panel would like to jump in and respond?
May I?
Go right ahead, Ambassador.
Thank you very much. Well, what I think we're seeing right now is the coordination that's taking place among the member states. When I mention institutions such as CARFA, that is the functional cooperation side of regional integration, whereby CARFA is providing not only testing services, but actually technical advice to member states. CARFA has developed a number of protocols that's coordinated through the chief medical officers of all of the countries. They meet very, very regularly. And some of these protocols have made their way up to the heads of government level for approval. I haven't mentioned too much about integration on the trade side, which would take another webinar or seminar like this. But I think there is some trade still taking place in our region. It's not where the level we want it to because of quote unquote the lockdown of the borders, but there's still some openings where our informal traders, the higglers, the hucksters are still allowed to travel on board to some of our member states to deliver their products There's some protocols when they arrive about not being able to disembark and that sort of thing, but that's working out. But I want to emphasize the integration we're speaking about. It's integration as the functional cooperation side. We also have the side of the foreign policy coordination. A lot of work is being done in terms of reaching out to the international community to promote the plight of SIDS. I believe the question also had to do with SIDS. The plight of SIDS, the coordination with the Pacific Island Forum, outreach to the OECD, to the World Health Organization. That's being done in a very coordinated manner, and integration is allowing that to happen.
And we're grateful for that response. And I think there's a follow-up question that I came to mind, and in my discussion with a member, that insofar as the unemployment, high unemployment in the countries that are experiencing it, well, it's worldwide, that would lead to high unemployment. And so there will be a significant reduction in disposable income for those persons who we, the small island developing states, rely heavily on to travel to our countries and to create that employment levels that we need to help our economies to move. So what measures are in place, or how are we as the, in terms of the collective body, what measures are we taking to address that possibility? I know, I'm telling you, when our colleague there made her presentation, I thought, doom and gloom, but that is not the state that we want to be in. We want to be in a very positive, enlightened position. So, but how do we expect to deal with that reality that we're facing now? Ambassador, if you want to jump in.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Madam Chairperson. Well, we have begun a discussion on a CARICOM bubble. That is the term that is being used now when you try to allow for a freer movement of persons and by extension, I would imagine, goods among countries that are at the like stage of addressing the pandemic. Only yesterday, as the government met in a session, and so we're looking at that as a possibility. The issue here, however, is that you have to be at a similar stage to allow for that to happen. But my own view is that there's sufficient number of member states at a more or less parallel level to allow for the creation of a bubble. Among those, we have the outlier of Haiti, and we're seeing what's happening in the situation with Suriname only in the past 2 weeks. However, a bubble is as strong as if some countries have a protocol that may open up to external, open the borders to external travel for the tourism, and others don't, it then raises a question: how do you manage the travel between such a country and a country that's opened up to third countries and those who have not yet done that? One of the issues that we could look at, and it would have to require testing, of course. Testing is always at the heart of trying to manage COVID and contact tracing. One of the issues that could be looked at, I say could, we have not quite reached there, is there, quote unquote, a bubble passport that could be issued, that somebody has been tested and within a particular time frame that person can enter, and that sort of thing. But the discussion has started, is very, very early discussion. So let's see how far we can get this moving forward. Many of the member states are looking, because of the critical domestic financial situation and economic situation, many of them are looking more to the external. The heavy dependence on tourism, the bigger chunk of tourism on the GDP, on the economy, is causing some member states to move faster in that direction, and then it creates a somewhat more complex attempt at doing this bubble. Had we started this earlier, and that discussion did start early, had we started that bubble earlier, we might have been in the bubble and then been allowed us to open to the outside, but fortunately we didn't get there.
Appreciate that, thank you. We have two questions,
Sure.
Senator Nicholas and then Senator Humphreys. Senator Sean Nicholas from Antigua, and then we'll go to President Chester Humphreys of Grenada. Senator Nicholas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think I am more concerns rather than questions. But first, I want to say thank you very much to the panel this morning. I think the presentations were quite timely, quite insightful, and I think all of us would have learned something this morning. But I came to this discussion with two concerns in mind, and they were addressed somewhat, and I don't know, might not have the time to go into them. But the first one has to do with countries in, for example, us in the Caribbean region, and our difficulties in having access to finance to help us in our post-COVID-19 recovery. We are in a situation where many of our countries are heavily indebted, and that juxtaposed with that is the fact that they say that we are high-income countries, and as such do not qualify for some of these loans and even grants. So I am not sure if we could have a little discussion on that, and how can we somehow maneuver our way in terms of accessing finance to help us in our relief or recovery. My second concern had to do with the social support that are being suggested from the various speakers. And I feel heartened by the presentations because, as we know, in crises, and especially what we are experiencing now, women are more impacted. I like the idea when we say we have to look at what's happening through special lenses. And as one presenter said, look at the gendered impact. One of the fallouts, of course, of the pandemic being job losses. And what does that mean for our women, who many are single-headed household, head of household, and sometimes the main breadwinner. So I'm happy to hear of the best practices that are being implemented in some places that some of us may think of adopting in terms of helping our women in coping at a time like this. So as I said, it's more concerns rather than questions that I'll put on the table. Thank you for listening.
Okay, I'm going to invite two other questions, and then we'll go back to the presenters for answering. So if they could take notes in the interim. I'm going to now invite President Chester Humphreys from Grenada to pose his question.
Okay, let me first of all say thanks to ParlAmericas and also the presenters. I thought it was a very condensed but comprehensive overview of the socioeconomic situation which is facing the region. Incidentally, the question that I actually wanted to ask was asked by Sean Nicholas just before me. And that was to address the issue raised by the Secretary General in respect of our high debt to GDP ratios, our extreme climate change vulnerabilities, and the drastic decline in state revenues. And that question, my question is specifically directed to Monica. What would the OECD do in a sense of an immediacy with changing the way in which they grade us so that we can have access to the necessary fundings and so on, because our situation and the impact on the people is exceedingly real. And as the Secretary General has pointed out, we are facing another season of hurricanes, and which can be quite devastating. I mean, I don't even want to contemplate the region suffering with another set of hurricanes on top of this COVID situation. And therein lies my question to Monica. What can be done in an immediate sense in order to address these structural, very real issues that we have, and the fact that we are treated, to my mind, very unfairly in the context of the overall world economic situation and the distribution of wealth? Because the question of access to affordable loans and grants and so on is a question of equity, actually, economic equity and economic justice. That's essentially the questions that we're talking about, manifested in different ways. And there could be no doubt that as small island states with limited resources, I mean, Grenada has, well, the rest of countries, especially those on tourism, have had suffered greatly because of this pandemic. We have put a number of measures in place, a lot of it with gender focus. So for example, we had to close our tourism sector very early. The large majority of employees in the tourism sector are women. And when the government introduced income support, and it gave a guarantee of 3 months income support to all workers in the hotel sector, we were primarily talking about women. Now, when you come to the informal sector, the people who trade with their spice baskets, the small vendors, again, they're again primarily women. And the government has extended state assistance to those persons. But of course, this is limited. And so that's my question to you. What can we expect as an immediate redress in the situation that we face in the context of all that the Secretary General has so eloquently put forward?
Thank you, President Humphreys. We would ask the panelists to respond to those two, and then we have 2 further questions that we would entertain after. I don't know if Monica, who's that? Sorry, I'm not seeing. Okay, yeah, sure, please.
Okay, just to address the concerns regarding financing the response to COVID, and this is really fundamental. I think the concern that we don't have the fiscal space, we don't have the resources, given the heavy level of indebtedness, to be able to respond effectively. In the first instance, there's the question of liquidity. We just don't have the ready cash. And there are IFIs, like the IMF, for example, has something they call a rapid credit facility that is supposed to assist in times of distress where liquidity is concerned. But, you know, we had a meeting with the finance ministers a couple of weeks ago, and their complaint was that there were too many conditionalities attached to that kind of liquidity support. You know, in respect of structural adjustment. In times like of crisis, you just need help. So that is a discussion that that should happen all on its own. The question of liquidity support. Then there was also a concern that we simply cannot, given the levels of indebtedness that exist and the debt to GDP ratios already out of whack, we can't afford to incur any further debt. So we don't need loans, we need concessionary support. One of the areas in which we continue to advocate for that kind of investment and to seek support is with investing in resilience, focusing on the other major exogenous factor that impacts our viability in the region, and that is our environmental vulnerability, the impact of climate change, the impact of hurricanes. And it's one of the areas, because of our vulnerability, that we can still get concessionary support. We can get concessionary support from the Green Climate Fund. We need to be focusing on developing projects, investing in projects that build the resilience of our region, using concessionary financing still available to the region. As I say, and investing in resilience also gives the opportunity for green investment, which is also has an impact in structural adjustment. So you're actually ensuring that you give a certain degree of long-term viability to the economies, and the restructuring through green investment using concessionary resources. That's another area. And then there are other areas that we can be looking at. There has been, I think, success by countries like Grenada in ensuring that we have hurricane clauses put in or loan agreements that ensure that we recognize, that the international community recognizes that there are these important factors that impact the ability of the countries of the region to repay their debts, and general low-cost mechanisms of various types. There are ways in which we can do it, but it requires a comprehensive degree of advocacy on the part of the countries as a whole, speaking as one voice. And there is certainly a very important role for Parliament to play in inviting a greater level of participation of our traditionally risk-averse private sector, public-private partnership, investment on the ground in country through a greater involvement of the private sector is going to be important, because they are also a source of income, but they tend to want to have the cover of the government, of the public sector. We need to ensure that we have greater investment in the by the private sector in restructuring and in ongoing investment. Thanks.
I just wanted to add something. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'm not sure who's speaking.
Therese.
Okay, great.
As I'm representing an IFI, so I wanted to add something on this debate about the concessional financing. So I think what COVID-19 has thrown up for the region is it's amplified our vulnerabilities. First of all, as discussed by the Secretary General, as emphasized by ACLAC, Diane, just now. But I think what it also is forcing every policymaker that's working in this region is to think through, how do we prevent this kind of situation from recurring? And obviously we can't prevent another global pandemic, but how do we shore up, whether it's public finances or whether it's diversifying the economies, whether it's more regional integration to make sure we build up buffers, rethinking the dominance of mono industries like tourism in even the smallest countries. So there's a short-term need to get ourselves out of the crisis, but then there's also the medium-term and long-term recovery that I think we need to be asking these difficult questions. So the recovery that the IDB is looking at bridging this, if we say coming out of this mess, is how do we create enough buffers, whether it's by introducing new economic sectors, right? So small developing countries like ours can't be so 100% dependent on one particular sector. And we're seeing this now in the Bahamas, in Barbados, in Jamaica, on tourism. In Jamaica, there's agriculture, so there are linkages, and thankfully, there are 350,000 people unemployed, but there's still a lot going on in Jamaica, whereas in the Bahamas, there's 50% unemployment at the moment. How do we start as policymakers to look for those new pathways to offer economic opportunities to young people, right? So we know that, as you saw in the data, highest rates of unemployment are in young people. We also happen to have the highest levels of crime and violence in this region because of that number, not necessarily all of it, but we're also finding that our educational outcomes are not generating enough value in our human capital to diversify, right? So I want to say that there are opportunities coming out of this crisis that we need to start thinking about. And first is transforming education. We need a different kind of skilled worker in the Caribbean. It's not just someone who can get out of high school and go to be a bartender or someone working on a poolside in a hotel, which is currently what we have. Those are very low value jobs. We need jobs that create more value and insert us into the global economic sphere so that the Caribbean really becomes a powerhouse of creativity, of innovation, of knowledge. And we haven't embraced technology as a bridge to do that. So we've been emphasizing for a long time, at least I've been managing this region now for 3 years, we've been emphasizing a digital transformation as the platform for that, to create more value for what we do, and that the world becomes our marketplace. We cannot continue to be just producing low value either goods or services. And I think that's one of the biggest lessons for every policymaker, looking for those opportunities to do that and finding ways to do it. And the second part to this is the green economy offers that kind of opportunity. While we are diversifying our energy mix, whether it's to geothermal or whether it's to LNG or whether it's to solar, that's a real opportunity for people who are in the sciences, people who are in energy, people who want to do more on energy efficiency. That's a sector that is ripe for innovation. All of our hotels need to be run on renewable energy. So we have opportunities there. I think this road to the Marshall Plan for the Caribbean is a difficult one, because whether we like it or not, we are not Mozambique, we are not Haiti, and we are not all Dominica. And so the fact that we have this tension between our high GDP per capita and our high levels of debt, and when you do a deep dive into why those high levels of debt exist, it goes back to climate change, natural disasters, rebuilding infrastructure, and so on. We have to take a really honest look at the way this region has thrived in the past, and I don't think it's sustainable anymore. We need to find other pathways. Thanks.
Thank you. I believe we have a question posed or to be posed by our colleague Glenys Roberts from Grenada. I will invite her to do so. And I would also ask the panelists if you could have a look at the chat. There are about 2 or 3 questions there. I know in relation to the last intervention by Therese, there's a question being asked insofar as what blueprints or plans are in place for diversification in our region and diversification strategies. So in the next session, when you're able to comment as the panelists, we would ask that you comment on those questions posed. And there's one there from Speaker Anisette George from Trinidad as well. But I would now invite our colleague, Roberts Glenys from Grenada, to make a contribution.
Thank you very much. What I think this pandemic has brought about is weaknesses in what we have already identified, but also into our social security systems. Additionally, how do we treat not only the women, but children during the pandemic, and our teens, the psychological effect of having to be locked down for a period of time, not being able to interact with friends, because, you know, socially for children in learning, seeing their peers is critical. So that showed up for us, you know, that aspect of it. And additionally, elderly, they got caught, you know, falling through the cracks, not being able to have access to social media or even television or radio because they live alone. So those are the things going forward as we chart, you know, the way forward, not for COVID, but for other disasters. I mean,
we try to do everything else, like to bring them food and all of that. But what it also raises the head for, to the point that Therese just made, how do we diversify our economy? How do we shift from just the focus on tourism, and how do we get that balance so that we can develop sustainably? And because what has been happening in our quest to follow the tourism map is that we were destroying the environment, not understanding what's the importance of the mangrove, not understanding what's the importance of the birds. So now in COVID, we are seeing the birds flying, we are seeing the skies are nice and pretty, the breeze is nice, you're seeing butterflies now, which I think it's a blessing. But I think we need to look at the elderly and the psychosocial too, as we look for something to drive the economy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that reminder. Before we go to the panelists, I'm going to ask Furbert, is it from Bermuda? Would you?
Yes, Tanae Furbert.
Tanae, thank you. Thank you, Tanae.
Okay.
And then we will go to Speaker Anisette George. After Tanae, yes. Go ahead, Tanae.
Good morning. I don't know if it's morning, afternoon right now, but hello to everyone. I'm just expressing, you know, we were having the conversation in regards to 90% of women being essential workers, and noting the unemployment rate across countries right now being very high. Prior to COVID-19, there were many persons working multiple jobs just to make ends meet. And so my concern is that I'm just wondering if other countries have put in policies or legislation that has restricted healthcare professionals such as nurses and nurses assistants from working between nursing homes because of the risk, working between hospitals, working between long-term care facilities to try to reduce the spread of COVID-19. I do have some concerns as it relates to policies and legislation which restricts people's employment opportunities. So I'm just curious to see if anyone has experienced, any other countries have experienced sort of policies and legislation being put in place. And I do know that there is a shortage of healthcare professionals across countries, and that this putting policies and legislation such as that in place would pose a huge problem. So I'm just wondering if anyone can speak to that. Thank you.
Very interesting question, especially for us in CARICOM. I will have Speaker Anisette George pose a question or make a contribution, and then we'll go back to the panelists. Speaker Anisette.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. In all of the discussion, even though we've had some emphasis on women, all the recovery plans seem to be looking at the hard figures of GDP and also the building resilience in the green economy. And I'm wondering, where does the care industry, the purple economy, fit into all of this? Because in identifying the impact on women, a lot of what we've looked at comes from the aspect of the purple economy and caring. And in terms of charting a new way forward, how do we begin to develop plans and policies and access funding to input the purple economy and caring into this new economic order?
Thank you. I'm not sure which of the panelists would like to proceed first.
Can I try and venture a little bit on this? I have to confess, and please forgive my ignorance. It's the first time, Madam Speaker, I've heard of the purple economy. and I'm going to latch onto that one. Prior to during the course of last year, we began working on expanding the categories for free movement in our region. And we identified a number of areas, I believe, that would impact on the particular area, the purple economy you mentioned. We looked at, generally speaking, we looked at the hospitality sector, we looked at caregivers, we looked at within the context of domestic workers, because there is a request, there is a move to allow for domestic workers to move. We also looked at, just for a matter of information, to look at agricultural workers. We got bogged down in terms of definitions, looking at definitions within the context of the ILO to guide us. But at the end of the day, as an integration, as a secretariat that doesn't have any implementation authority, we can only go as fast as the slowest in the region. A lot of technical work has been done on those categories. We still do not yet have any agreement on those areas. Another area we looked at was security workers. I think we even changed the name slightly to allow for that. And how do you merge those with the Caribbean Vocational Qualification System, the CVQ, so that you know if you have a domestic worker or somebody who's a caregiver, that person is in fact a caregiver in accordance with a particular standard that has been set. A lot of work has gone into that, Madam Speaker. I just regret to tell you that the progress is painfully slow. We got the overarching agreement from the heads of government to pursue those discussions. As a matter of fact, some of them came from the heads of government themselves to pursue those discussions. But then we got bogged down, and then of course, a lot of the work that we're doing that requires some of that thing to be happening has slowed down considerably because of that. But it is something I will continue to work on. I wish I could tell you when that could be done, but regrettably not. A recovery plan, and Therese mentioned a number of areas for diversification. I too also, I think she's spot on all of what has been said. The digital transformation is critical, very, very, very critical. And especially now, how do you take advantage of what we've done, what we're doing now? How do we assess what we've done now to advance that digital agenda? We have a digital agenda. Again, that's moving painfully slow because we move as fast as the slowest. And it is frustrating that you do all the technical work, you convene all the technical meetings, and then you still cannot get agreement. So you keep going at it over and over. I think one of the areas where our parliamentarians can really assist is perhaps, one of the things I do very often, I track the budget speech, the budget debate in all our parliaments. And I do a little something. I say, let me see how many times economic integration is mentioned. Let me see how many times CARICOM is mentioned, to see whether or not that is part of the policy of the government of the day in terms of its financing. We know that everybody is committed, but in terms of the nuts and bolts of the budget, is it there? And perhaps parliamentarians, I would be very happy at some point in the future. Allow me to get over this immediate hump, to assemble one or two of my top advisors and to do a session with you as we have now on CARICOM, to bring you up to date on what we're working on as a secretariat, to bring you up to date on the deficit that is out there, that we just can't seem to get movement on, and to solicit your voice in Parliament to help us to get that. So I thank you for the question. I'm making an offer that at an appropriate juncture in the near future, I'm prepared to come back along with some of my very top advisors to hold a session with you that we could focus on what CARICOM is, what we're doing, what are the bottlenecks, how we can move forward, and so on. I don't want to lose sight of the question raised by my dear friend Senator Humphrey on the access to concessional financing. It is a big part of any Marshall Plan that we could put forward. It is a big part of any recovery plan that we have, given where we are right now. And it's short term, but it's also long term. because Therese is also very, very correct. When you look at what has happened to us historically, the exogenous shocks, both economic from 2007-2008 period that impacted the entire region. We now have another exogenous shock that is impacting the entire region. But in between that period, the number of shocks that we've had and what we've seen happen in the period between 2016, 2017, 18, 19 in particular, is the number of hurricanes increasing and the spread of disaster, at the same time drought impacting agriculture and floods in off-seasonal times. And vulnerability must be taken into account. Vulnerability must be taken into account. And we need a concerted fiscal diplomacy. And I use that term. We are doing it at our level. I know our ministers of foreign affairs are doing it, but we need more voices to join with that. So when ambassadors come to see you, honorable members of parliament, you know, these are some of the issues you need to raise. The vulnerability of our member states, economic vulnerability, social vulnerability, environmental vulnerability. That we need an understanding. We're not begging for handouts, but to use an outdated mathematical equation of per capita GDP to address what is happening in the world of today, with climate change, with greater facilitation of travel, which allows for pandemics to occur with greater frequency. You're going to see this. This is not a one-off thing. Eh? This is not a one-off thing. Forgive me for saying so. It's going to happen again because there's a tremendous amount of movement of persons globally. This is globalization. And it's very easy to do that. We have to prepare for it. We have to invest in the health sector. We have to invest in other sectors to allow this to happen. But these days need an understanding, and the OECD is where it starts. Forgive me, I'm sorry, I'm not trying to put my colleague on the OECD on a spot. I don't think it's her department. There's a committee called the Development Advisory Committee that deals with this definition of per capita income and per capita GDP and puts us into these categories that we just can't seem to get out of. And we start there and we lobby the members. Unfortunately, the only member of ParlAmericas that's a member of the DAC is Canada. And Canada is a good friend and has shown tremendous understanding when it comes to our plight on per capita income and climate change. For those, you're also members of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association, United Kingdom, and there are others. Canada is also part of the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. We have to use those channels. I know it's sometimes you're bogged down on your domestic agenda, but these international agenda, the international agenda also impacts on your domestic agenda. The blacklisting that we're dealing with right now, European Union are great friends, but this blacklisting of our countries, I know this is on COVID, but it impacts our economy. All of these things, when you put all of these things together, you have a perfect storm, you know. You just have to pray to God that we don't have another hurricane this year. So your voices in the fiscal diplomacy, in your outreach, in using ParlAmericas as far as you can, and each one has connections. There are a number of members of ParlAmericas that are members of the G20. The G20 is another very influential international grouping. Mexico is a member, of course, Canada is a member, the United States, Argentina, Chile, a number of members of the G20 up in ParlAmericas. So we need to educate all of the ParlAmericas group, all, not just CARICOM, all on the plight that we're facing and see how we could work together in this areas. Forgive me for being so long in the response.
Ambassador, I'm very grateful, and I would have liked to end on your presentation there, your responses. Very poignant matters that you've raised there, but we have two other contributors. What we will do, we will hear from Senator Winston Garraway from Grenada, and then Senator Sophia Longmore from Jamaica. Then we'll go back to the panelists for their closing remarks, and in that session, they would be able to address whatever concerns or issues were raised by these last two members who are going to pose their questions, and then we'll do our wrap-up. So again, we will hear from Senator Winston Garraway, then Senator Sophia Longmore from Jamaica. Senator Garraway.
Thanks very much, Madam Chair, and I firstly want to say a special thank you to ParlAmericas for putting on this excellent presentation to us, and at least I'm richer in knowledge for the presentation that was made. My concern, though, is based on, yes, the current pandemic that we're faced with, but the Atlantic hurricane season. As you're aware, the season is forecast to be above average, meaning that we have some 16 named storms, 8 of which is likely to develop into hurricanes and 4 into major hurricanes. But as you're aware, it only takes one storm or hurricane to change the life of a country. That being said, with COVID-19 on our doorsteps or in our homes, in our countries, the need, if there is an impact from a hurricane, the need for emergency shelters will be great or greater. Given that the social or physical distancing that is being recommended, we will definitely need more shelters, because in small economies like ours, on the threat of a hurricane, the impact of a hurricane, we open those shelters as safe havens for persons to move into. Again, we will need definitely more shelters. And given that economies have been battered so severely over the years, we have challenges in maintaining those that we have. So to have an increase at this point in time will be extremely, extremely dangerous or serious for us. And given all that has been said as it relates to the downturn in the economies and the debt to GDP ratio, and basically countries are strangled to find additional cash, we will need that support. And my major concern for shelters, or emergency shelters, you will definitely have to ensure that the persons are properly trained to administer management within those shelters. The need for the PPEs and the other equipment or material that is necessary to ensure that the environment is conducive and safe, there will be a greater need. And we do know that economies have already been stretched. So every support that can be given is needed at this point in time. And I heard that the representative from the IDB spoke of support from, I think it was the OECD, support from the IMF and so forth. Yes, the World Bank has programs that will assist, like the CAT-DDO program and so forth, will assist countries to be able to respond immediately after the impact. But that could only take you thus far. So, as I've said, I'm happy with the information that has been given, but it also poses more challenges for us as disaster management managers in the region to deal with this impending situation that is unfolding before us. Thanks.
Thank you. Our colleague from Jamaica, Longmore.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. I will be doing the closing remarks, but I wanted to raise this concern, comment, question. As we are here executing in a virtual space, how can we enhance the delivery of this space in terms of how it could impact education, healthcare delivery, business development, as there is a definite industry that is emerging virtually, and significant prospects can be made. We've heard many speakers relate to the very heavy dependence that we have on tourism in the area and other vulnerable industries. There's also opportunity that we may be able to experience. And what I am somewhat concerned about is if there is any guidance that we may have with respect to the safe development of the virtual operations of our parliaments and the many sectors that virtual development could impact on, and particularly with respect to the use of 5G technology. There's a lot of reports, conflicting reports regarding the safety of 5G technology. We in this region are very vulnerable to certain effects in combination with other predispositions that we have towards disasters. And of course, with the strain on our healthcare sectors already and our limited resources, the potential, if any great negative effect is there with respect to 5G technology, can be quite impacting on our populations. So I just wanted to see if there's any input with respect to that, particularly along the arms of the potential use and effectiveness of the virtual world, but also safely doing so. Thank you.
Thank you, Doc. Sorry, Senator and Dr. Longmore. You'll hear again from Dr. Longmore shortly, but I would ask the other ambassadors, the other panelists to respond to the intervention so far. I would start now with Ambassador Larocque, if you would like to contribute.
Thank you, Madam Chair. If I may just, as far as safety and of the ICT sectors, and how do you take advantage of the digital transformation that is allowing us to? I think there are a couple fronts. Let me deal with the safety first. It is a concern. It is the fact that some of our government websites have been hacked, for instance. We've had meetings of CARICOM. There's anything good out of COVID that I don't travel as much. I miss coming to the various countries, but I spend a little more time at home. So we're having we're having meetings just about every week. We have one other meeting, and persons have hacked into our meetings. Persons have logged on that have no business being there, and we're looking very seriously at the security at that level. But at a larger level, Impacts is working along with some international assistance on digital safety. How do you treat with that? I personally don't have all of the information, but I know it's being worked on. It's an area that is crying out for attention. I think one of the areas we have to look at, and again, if we talk about digital transformation, is that we have to cooperate. It cannot be that we have the OECS has an arrangement among most of their member states with ECTEL, the Eastern Caribbean Telecommunications Authority, but all of the rest of the member states have separate arrangements for governing the digital economy. There ought to be, there must be greater collaboration, because you're dealing with multinationals that have a great tendency and a great amount of experience in dealing with us individually and dividing us in terms of the response that we give to them when we negotiate. We have to bring the price down of access to make this thing meaningful. We have to bring the price down of access to the internet. If you're going to use it, in the education system more and more, you have to bring it. One of the things that is showing up now, I'm sure you're all aware of it at the national level, is the number of students who don't have access to be able to be schooled online. Especially those countries with large rural populations. That is a real crisis. How do you bring the cost down? How do you make it more ubiquitous so that it can be accessed and it's a tool for development, it's a tool for reaching out. It's a sector in its own right, but it's also a significant facilitating tool, whether it's in education, whether it's in telemedicine, whether it's in e-governance, and you can go on, telemarketing, and so on. We've started work on it again. I don't want to wash linen in the public, but it's sometimes so difficult to get our relevant experts from the various countries to come together, even via the very internet that we're talking about, to hold discussions on those things. If I may just respond as well in closing to Minister Garraway. Minister Garraway, the hurricane season is a worry. The fact that shelters, I know that SIDEMA is working with member states to look at that. Shelters can be overcrowded. And how do you physical distance in shelters? SIDEMA has a plan, a disaster plan, Minister, that will take in not only the COVID, but also the hurricane coming down the stream. But your appeal for assistance as well, to allow for us to survive both COVID and a hurricane is very much so. We're also working, CDMA is also working, Caribbean Disaster Emergency Management Agency is also working on how do you mobilize within the system of borders being closed. On a hurricane, the response is also regional. We pull people from every single member state and we focus on the member state or member states that is devastated. How do you move within a context of closed borders to bring your first responders, to bring your health personnel and so on. And that's being worked on, and that's been having discussions at the national level through the CDMA apparatus. I think this is my last word. Thank you very much for this opportunity. I found it rather interesting. I must confess, I wasn't aware of the ParlAmericas group. I am very much more familiar with the Commonwealth Parliamentary Association. I hope I'm not treading on anybody's competitive ground, but that's the one I'm a little more familiar with. But now that I know that you can convene a CARICOM subgroup of ParlAmericas, my offer remains as an outreach to you to see if we can work some more together. I need some more voices to help me to advance my program. We're now trying to develop our new regional strategic plan. The last one expires this year. We were supposed to come out with a new one. We went out, we started consultation with all member states. Some parliamentarians did take part in about 6 member states so far on the new strategic plan to identify what are the priority areas for our region to focus attention on. Not just by the Secretariat. It is not a Secretariat plan, it's a plan for the community that would involve the member states, that would involve all the regional institutions. And I hope we're looking to see how we can continue the consultations using the technology, because we need to complete that plan. And we can do special sessions as well for you. But thank you so very much for this opportunity. And I wish you all the best, and please stay well.
Ambassador, thank you very much. And I can tell you that Senator Henfield, who is our regional rep, will be in touch with you shortly to set up that subgrouping meeting. We now invite Monica Kaiser to share her final reflections on this matter. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I was asked a couple of times about the OECD and the classification of countries. Now, I have to say that I work in the social policy division. I'm head of the social policy, and that's not, we don't work directly with the Development Assistance Committee, as was mentioned by the ambassador. So I'm not quite the right person to make any comments on this matter. And, but I can only support what was said, that this is also a case of finding the right member countries of the OECD to support your cause, because the OECD functions as a secretariat. That means the people, we're not an international financial institution, so the OECD does not give out any loans or grants or anything like that. And it is a forum where member countries come together and discuss, and we assist the member countries in finding consensus. So whatever decisions come out of the OECD, this is not the OECD putting them forward, but it is the member countries agreeing on a certain, in all the different areas that we have. For example, in my area, we have a gender recommendation there was some text proposed, which member countries then modified and discussed until they came to a common understanding. It's a consensus principle. So the important thing is actually to find member countries who take certain causes on board, as was already very well described by Ambassador Leroc. I would like to comment on the question on caring. And the question of long-term care personnel moving between different institutions. This is indeed a problem and has been shown to be a problem in many OECD countries. As I said before, the work conditions for caring staff are often precarious and often only part-time, which means that it just, in order to survive, the people engaged in long-term care have to move around from one place to another. And very often it's also people who come, migrants in European countries, for example, who come from Eastern European countries and who go back and forth between their countries. And of course, also there's a risk of propagating the virus. So this was actually realized, I think, fairly late in the game. And it was only later than that policymakers started realizing the extreme dangers of contamination in old age care homes. And what I mentioned in my presentation, working on better work conditions and having proper jobs in long-term care and not precarious work, which obliges the carers to run around between different institutions, between different clients, spend the day in the car, and piecing together a whole range of jobs in order to make ends meet, that is not an acceptable situation. But of course, and this is again where we come to the limit as usual, it's a matter of finance also. And countries do have to decide at some point how much money they want to put to this problem of long-term care, and offer proper conditions, which of course also mean proper wages. And since many of these long-term carers are employed by the public sector, this is then where we need not only a commitment of words, but also financial commitment to improve the situation of the carers. I'll just stop there and leave the floor to other panelists to comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica. We'll invite Therese to do her final reflections.
Thank you so much. Like Erwin, this is my first foray into ParlAmericas, and I find that this can be a very powerful force for change. So thank you for inviting me and having the IDB here. I just wanted to make one comment on the carers side, which is in a positive way, which is the World Economic Forum looking at the future of work in terms of trying to project what kind of jobs will really be abundant in 2040 and beyond. That the whole industry of care is a growth industry. And part of this is because we're now in the fourth industrial revolution, where we're going to be working more with machines and more with artificial intelligence. But the one area that still will require human beings is this whole industry of care. Whether it's looking after the elderly in OECD countries because of their demographic changes. By the way, our demographic changes in the Caribbean are also shifting after 2030 and beyond. We're going to have much more older populations. So nursing, doctors, mental health professionals, that's a growing industry. And I was very, very pleased to see that Jamaica announced last week, well, I think it was the University of the West Indies who made the announcement, that they're going to be investing more in expanding the nursing school to develop more nurse professionals in Jamaica, because as you know, as fast as they're produced in Jamaica, they're exported or they migrate, and they're the ones sending back huge levels of remittances to a country like Jamaica. So I want to say that is, if we want to look at the care industry as a positive, that's a growth area for jobs in the future. So that's just something to think about. Finally, on the whole issue of digital transformation and the importance of regional integration in this, I couldn't agree with Erwin more. We can start with digital identity, which of course is something that 3 countries in this region are now struggling, well, attempting to do: Jamaica, Bahamas, Barbados. And without a digital identity, it's going to be difficult to deal with the issues that Senator Longmore raised. It's about cybersecurity. It's about having systems that are extremely secure, because if all of our information is going to be lodged in digital buckets, let's use that as a simple way of describing it, then we need to make sure that this information is secure and it can't be hacked. So I think in this area, we have a huge agenda, but the opportunity for governments, and this is the message for parliamentarians here, the opportunity for governments is to make your citizens happy, right? If your citizens don't have to stand in line for hours to do transactions and they can do that digitally, you have a happy citizen. You could be reelected the next go round. And I think this is the piece of the puzzle that is not quite appreciated by people making the policy. I mean, the purpose of government is to facilitate, one, the private sector, but also to facilitate services to be delivered to its citizens. And there are much better ways we can do that in our region. We need to move away from paper. We need to move away from cash. We need to become a lot more involved in the digital agenda, and I think we will see that here we have opportunities to become much more competitive, to become a region where people want to do business and where we excel. So thank you. Thank you very much for this opportunity. It's been great.
And thank you very much, Therese. May I invite Diane now to give her final reflections?
Thank you very much, Madam President. And I too, newly familiar with ParlAmericas. Thank you very much for this invitation, and look forward to seeing a greater use of this forum to advance the interests of the Caribbean, and certainly in this case, I have to speak first as a Caribbean citizen and support SG in the need for the parliamentarians of the Caribbean to give a greater level of support and commitment to the objectives and the program of the CARICOM, of the CARICOM Secretariat. CARICOM is the preeminent voice and identity of the Caribbean. It is the principal forum for political advocacy on behalf of the countries and the people of the region, and it is important, therefore, for our governments and our parliaments to give support to the agenda. It is important that that group that is being created is one of the best things I'm hearing in terms of the outcome of this meeting, and I fully support it, if only because of my commitment to the advancement of the region. It's also important because there are so many of the elements of the CSME that depend for their success on collaboration between the countries of the region. And so the whole business of freedom of movement and freedom of work, and the very issue of the purple economy, because this is an opportunity for public-private collaboration, but you will not have private sector persons investing in an industry where there is uncertainty in their ability to get the factors of production. If they can't get the labor, I have a favorite Jamaican restaurateur here in Trinidad that I go to for all my Jamaican eats, and he tells me, you know, this business of the QVC, the certificate that he needs to get for his workers when he wants to bring his Jamaican chefs and so on, and the drama that he has to go through. We need to ensure that the countries themselves are making the ability for that movement of services and people within our region helpful, so that you can have effective public-private investment. So that is something for CARICOM, for the people of the region, to think about in supporting the Caribbean and the CARICOM agenda. SG, I don't know if you've heard of the orange economy. That's another one. That's creative industry. The creative industry is, to me, to some degree, it's risk-free in that it's not subject to a COVID or a hurricane. In other words, this is an industry that we can develop, and there is you don't find a more creative and talented people in this region. We really do need to be looking at, in terms of diversification, or I'm speaking now of diversification of our industry. So in the long term, here is where we can actually invest in our orange economy. And this also with a view to responding to the high levels of unemployment among our youth. What do we do with our youth? You know, we talk about skills development, we talk about TVET, we need to get away from the traditional reading, writing, arithmetic to a more practical agenda for our young people. We need to find ways to ensure that there's a greater level of investment in our youth, in non-traditional sectors. ICT, this is very important. And I'm speaking here of Trinidad, which is one of the wealthiest of the countries of our region. 68,000, representing 40% of the young people currently in lockdown, have no access to their education through either the broadband, the ICT infrastructure is just not there, and in some cases the students don't have the tablets, the facility to be able to receive their instruction, even though Trinidad does do some degree of circulation of these things. So the investment in technology with a view to enhancing all the various sectors, but I'm emphasizing education because this is important for our future. Investing in technology, investing in science and technology for any number of reasons. The multi-island character. This is one of the areas of vulnerability that I skipped over, but it is important. In a country like the Bahamas, most of the countries are Trinidad and Tobago, St. Vincent and the Grenadines. How do we ensure that there is effective governance in the multi-island scenario? Technology is the response. E-governance is very important. So there are many areas in which we can actually respond to the needs of the region, investing in adaptation and mitigation. I want to end with that, the issue of risk, development of risk resilience building in the region, investment in our green economy that results in that building of resilience, as well as in diversification of the economies, the green economy, the blue economy. These are areas in which we need to begin to look in the medium to long term. But first of all, we really do need some degree of concessionary support from the international community. And that is where I think we should be looking to the voice, the collective voice, the powerful voice that we can, with which we can reach the international community through CARICOM. Thank you very much. And thanks very much for the invitation.
We say a special thank you to all of our expert panelists for their final reflections and for their contributions. But before we end today, we invite you to please take a minute to answer the evaluation that is going to appear on your screen now. Your feedback on the process today helps ParlAmericas to ensure that the content delivered is of utility to parliamentarians in the region and the organization remains accountable to its donors and member parliaments. It doesn't take very long to do, so we could just take a little pause and, okay, well, great, thank you. And thank you all, colleagues, experts, the team from ParlAmericas for all the work that you've done to get us to this point. I believe the presentations today were very enlightening, and I trust that they have proved very helpful for us as we move forward as parliamentarians to understand our role in these challenging times. I have enjoyed the session thoroughly. Normally, on the other side, if I wasn't chairing, I'd be asking a lot of questions. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to be silent today. I am very thankful that we were able to do it within a reasonably good time. So thank you again for allowing me to moderate and assist us through this process. At this time, I would like to invite Senator Sophia Longmore from Jamaica, who's also a board member of ParlAmericas, to offer the concluding remarks. Thank you all and be safe.
Thank you very much, moderator. I really appreciate your seamless expedition of the session. Thank you so very much. Esteemed colleagues, dignitaries, guests of honor, expert panelists, Honorable Alinicia Williams-Grant, it is my pleasure to address you on this occasion and offer concluding remarks to what has been a thoroughly enriching meeting. Ambassador, welcome to the Forum of ParlAmericas, And as a board member myself, know that this is a very effective and efficient group. And I implore you to continue CARICOM's involvement in our work. The topics today covered offer profound insights on the vital task that lies ahead of us, the recovery of our economies after the profound disruption caused by the COVID-19 pandemic. This pandemic has emphasized our vulnerabilities, but gives us great opportunity to address them to be better prepared for future crises. Caribbean countries are heavily indebted and have difficulty in accessing financing. We need access to concessionary financing rather than loans as we continue to incur further debt, and we require investment in environmental resilience, especially. Tourism is a lifeblood of most of our economies. Let's hope that it still will play a very significant part. Now, nearly all revenue will be lost as there are unprecedented collapses in the outputs, and we are encouraged to think about mono industries in the short, medium, and long term. We need a strengthening data collection in our region. I think this has come out throughout much of the discussion, but it needs to be gender disaggregated data to be truly valuable, because we have heard of the many gender impacts of the pandemic. Local Caribbean data confirms the gender impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic in areas like unpaid care work, nutrition, sexual harassment, household care, and cultural expectations around all of these themes. And we all recognize the significant predisposition that women have because of the significant economic disparity. Helpful tools include gender impact assessments in emergency management and gender responsive budgeting. Levels of domestic abuse have soared. There's no question about that. And data is still coming in. Here in Jamaica, we're trying to assert data around that. And by extension, the welfare of children is also at risk. Women are taking on the majority of unpaid work and have the most precarious employment situations, as they represent 2/3 of the informal sector. Ms. Quessar and Ms. Turner-Jones both highlighted the importance of introducing stronger parental leave policies. There are improvements to be made on maternity allowances, but also important is to ensure leave is available for fathers. Recognize this will also be very helpful to mothers. ParlAmericas has a new publication on this topic, which I encourage you all to review. This crisis has a significant impact on mental health, which needs to be considered as part of the government support for social services provided to its citizens. I particularly have interest in this, being a clinical psychiatrist myself, and so the mental health impact is quite significant across all facets of our populations. For this reason, we must ensure that all parliamentary decision-making processes, for the reasons outlined before, are being undertaken a consideration of the gender lens, and that women are included in the decision-making bodies. A common point that was made is the current situation, while devastating, provides us great opportunities and how we may act on them. As we continue to plan and implement economic recovery measures in our countries, let's remember the importance of incorporating the principles of sustainability and gender equality discussed here today. Let us also remember the importance of continued dialogue in the region. Conversations like these allow for the exchange of strategies and best practices and offer a venue to address pressing questions and challenges that we face as a region. I want to again thank our moderator, the Honorable Annalicia Williams-Grant, President of the Senate of Antigua and Barbuda, for guiding the conversation so effectively and facilitating discussion. I also extend my gratitude to all of you, parliamentary colleagues, civil board members, and guests of honor. Your contributions and questions enrich the meeting and strengthen the conversation by providing valuable regional perspectives. Finally, I want to recognize the contribution of the Government of Canada to ParlAmericas, which is continuing, as it has always been, to provide parliamentarians from the Americas and the Caribbean with spaces to discuss common challenges during this pandemic. These will include further discussions around the integration of climate action in economic recovery plans, social protection with a gender equality lens, and a dialogue between Alicia Barceno, Secretary General of ECLAC, and presiding officers of the Anglophone Caribbean parliaments, as was recently held for our Latin American colleagues. We are also pleased to hear of Ambassador Larocque's proposal to host a future dialogue with top advisors from CARICOM, and the International Secretariat of ParlAmericas will follow up on this offer. Do stay tuned for announcements of these and other online meetings. I wish you all safety, prosperity, and health as you navigate these very difficult times, and look forward to our next time that we convene. Thank you again for your participation, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Thank you.